The new edition of the so-called Bible of Mental Disorders will be released soon. It's a manual that mental health professionals use to help determine a patient's diagnosis. This is the first time it has been revised in almost 20 years, but a growing number of people in the psychiatric community are not happy with the results. In fact, the director of the National Institute of Mental Health said that the new version suffers from a scientific lack of validity. Joining us this morning is Peter Bell, Executive Vice President for Programs and Services at Autism Speaks. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much for having me.
So you focus obviously on autism, and we'll get to why we invited you here to talk about this. But what do you think about the director of the National Institute of Mental Health? It's a pretty damning criticism. And this book, for people who don't know, basically defines what is considered a mental disorder. And it's revised every so often, but not very frequently. But it's the kind of thing that determines whether, say, you're just a person who likes to be on the internet all the time, or you're an internet addict, whether you have a disease or not, essentially. So What do you think of that criticism?
Well, I think the important thing to recognize here is that we need to have better ways in which we can identify the conditions, mental health conditions, like autism and a number of other things. And what we have right now, the tools that we have, really lack the ability to use lab tests to really understand the underlying biology. And so what I think Dr. Insel is trying to do is to get the community in general to look at what are some of the underlying biological symptoms and systems that are being affected by these mental health conditions. So I think it's, if anything, it's an enhancement of what we have currently. So, I think both of them can coexist, but what he's suggesting right now is that we use these new criteria to be able to look at research opportunities to really understand a lot of these conditions and how they might overlap with one another.
Right, let's get some science to back things up. But of course, in many cases with mental health issues, sometimes the science isn't quite clear, but you know that something is not right.
More and better research is always a good thing.
Indeed. So the reason why people in the autism community are concerned is because among the number of changes, the definition of autism will change as well. Right now, how is autism, or people on the autism spectrum, how are they defined in this book?
Well, autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and basically there are three domains that have some sort of impairment. It's either in a social domain, a communication domain, or repetitive behaviors. And what they're proposing to do with the changes in DSM is to collapse that into two different domains, one being a social communication one and another one being repetitive behaviors. They're also going to go from having 5 different subcategories to more of a dimensional type of a diagnosis called autism spectrum disorders. So there will no longer be the autistic disorder, PDD-NOS, Asperger's disorder, and actually it's just now going to be a autism spectrum disorder with an opportunity to create better characteristics that are associated with that type of autism. Modifiers and specifiers are the terminology that they're using, which will help them characterize the type of autism that they have.
So what are the concerns with this change? I remember reading somewhere that parents have been concerned that if Asperger's is no longer listed on its own, then they won't be eligible for services that they need. People are really scared.
Sure. I think the biggest concern is that if you currently have an autism spectrum disorder or some kind of autism, that you could potentially lose your diagnosis and therefore lose your access and ability to get services. The research that has been done thus far shows that the overlap is pretty good between the change of DSM-4 to DSM-5. There may be a few people that are no longer qualified for that diagnosis, but generally speaking, if you had an autism spectrum disorder before, you're going to have one going forward, and you should be able to continue to have services. But this is an area that will require more research, and we're going to have to certainly see how things go once the changes do take place.
Okay, so you talked about sort of a more blanket category with kind of factors, dimensions.
Exactly.
Give me an example. Say you were somebody who was diagnosed as high-functioning autistic. What would happen now with the change?
So what would happen is that you would actually meet criteria for having an autism spectrum disorder, but you might also have other types of characteristics related to that autism as part of your diagnosis. So you might have gastrointestinal problems. You might have epilepsy or seizure issues. You might have a specific gene mutation. So those are going to be the kinds of, as they call it, specifiers and modifiers that you would have along with your diagnosis, which again will give you a richer sense of the type of autism that you will have. And that's really, one of the big benefits of moving to this new way of diagnosing autism.
All right. So, what was the last time that the DSM was changed so significantly that affected the autistic community?
Well, the last time a change was made, a significant change, was in 1994, so it's almost 20 years ago. Wow. That actually was when they brought in Asperger's as being part of the autism spectrum, so to speak. And what resulted after that, there was a significant rise in the rate of autism. Now, some people have said that that's the cause of this huge increase that we've. It's not overdiagnosis so much, it's actually being able to put more people into that diagnostic category. But we only think that at this point about 50% of the increase, and we're talking about a 10-fold increase over the last 2 decades in terms of autism prevalence, about half of that is due to things like the broadening of the criteria, better awareness and so forth. But the other half, we still don't know. And that's something that is a big mystery in this community. And certainly a lot of people are wondering, why are we now reaching to a level where almost 2% of the population has an autism spectrum diagnosis?
Indeed, another reason to have you on another morning. Peter Bell, Executive VP of Programs and Services for Autism Speaks. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.